Okay, now we're going to go back to our social studies. We're on lesson 76. Let's start at page 146, the Pilgrims in England. If you remember yesterday, we talked about that the Pilgrims were a group of people called separatists. They did not want to worship the way the King of England worshiped. They wanted to choose their own way to God. And the English king did not like that. He wanted everybody to follow his church. And they didn't like that because they felt that the teachings of the Church of England was not strictly from the Bible. It was very much like the Catholic Church, which they had left a long time before. And it wasn't as spiritual as they wanted their church to be. And they would meet in homes. But then things got a little rough and tough. They were, not treated well, so they decided to go to Holland. And they were there for about 12 years. They were allowed to worship the way they wanted, but the problem is their children were beginning to pick up the language, the Dutch language, and learning about the ways of the Dutch people, maybe even as they got older, marrying the Dutch people. And their ways of life were different. So they planned, well, maybe we need to go to this new world. Jamestown had already been established in 1607, and this was around the 1620s. So remember, Jamestown was settled out of greed. This was a place where people wanted to make money. They weren't interested in really preaching to the woodland natives. But the Pilgrims, that was one of their goals, was not only to have their own church and worship the way they want to, but also spread the gospel to the woodland people. So they decided that they were going to go by ship, and that the ship would be called the Mayflower. And even before they left, they made a pact or an agreement. Maybe you want to call it a constitution. But it was the way that they were supposed to live, and it set down rules and regulations so everybody knew what had to be done. It was very much like a plan of action, so people would not be lost when they got there. They knew what was expected of them. Okay, so let's look on page 148. And it said that the ship was supposed to go to Virginia, maybe not too far from Jamestown, where the weather was warmer. And they hired a crew, and they named, with a ship named the Mayflower. The crew, of course, is the men that work on a ship. I'm reading page 148. The crew sailed the Mayflower across the ocean. Now, the Pilgrims lived in the middle deck of the Mayflower. The deck is a floor. They stayed in small, dark areas for many days. Even the children ate, slept, and played there. And I want to give you some information about the ship, about the voyage. Okay? Okay. Now we know that the Pilgrims did not have a ship to cross the Atlantic. So they had to have sailors and basically rent a ship, or they'll pay for it. They need to have sailors who knew how to read a map to get where they were going. And of course, the sailors could care less about going to a place where they could worship God as they pleased. They were just interested in making the money. It was a job, being a sailor. Okay, it says, on the voyage to the New World, the ship was very crowded. It carried over 100 passengers and a 30-man crew. The Pilgrims, or Separatists, there were also Puritans, and several children were the passengers. Living on the ship for 66 days, that's over 2 months, was difficult. They ate biscuits, salted meat, and other foods that could be stored for long periods of time. Their belongings, of course, were tools and seeds. They had to plant. Remember, Jamestown had problems with planting. Blankets, clothing, cookware, weapons, and Bibles were kept in trunks. Rarely were they allowed to get fresh air or exercise on the main deck, so they had to stay on the bottom for the most part. Most of the passengers became seasick. Often they were thrown against the walls when the heavy waves tossed the ship. At first, the sailors were not friendly to the Pilgrims. They made fun of them for saying prayers, singing hymns, and reading the Bible. However, by the end of the voyage, the sailors respected the Pilgrims for their strong faith in God. Page 150, and take a look at the ship that was used. Okay, we see that on the bottom of the ship, now remember the ship is called the Mayflower, that is where the supplies were kept. It was called the hold. Now you have to remember that sometimes the food got spoiled. Remember, rats sometimes inhabited the hold of the ship. They would come in from the harbors and the wharfs when the ship was being packed up, and sometimes they would eat the grain. Maybe the grain got wet, or the seeds, and it spoiled. In the middle deck, you could see that's where the Pilgrims stayed. That's where they slept. Maybe they slept on the floor with quilts and comforters, and that's where they ate, basically. The main deck is where the crew is working, and they don't really want people up there. Perhaps they went up on a day that it was sunny and nice and the water was calm. And then you have the sails. Here's the crow's nest. Look at the middle mast, and you see the little nest there, and that's where the sailors would look out with their telescopes and to see if there was land ahead. The sailing ships had, of course, the sails. There was nothing motorized about them. They depended upon the wind, and that's why they sailed at certain times of the year, so they knew that there would be the winds that would blow them across. Okay, now the Mayflower was a 90-foot merchant or cargo ship. Cargo means it wasn't a passenger ship. That's why there were no rooms. Maybe the captain had a room, or and his first mate, but it was a ship that was used to bring produce back and forth. And it had a total of 6 sails. 4 of the sails hung from 2 tall masts, and the 2 sails were in the front and the back of the ship. The crew worked the sails as officers shouted orders. Then the sails were rolled up during a storm. And the crow's nest, as I said, was on top of the main mast, and a sailor looked for land or danger, because remember, there were pirate ships that would come, especially if that cargo ship had gold and anything precious from the New World going back to Europe. The master or captain of the Mayflower was a man called Christopher Jones. He was in charge of navigating, and they used very simple tools such as the quadrant and the cross staff. That was to get the position of the stars to see that they were going in the right direction. Okay, let's look at the page 151, and look at that's a storm. The voyage on the Mayflower was not easy, but God watched over the Pilgrims. During a storm, a beam, one of these beams on the ship, cracked. And a beam is a log that holds the deck up. A Pilgrim had packed a large iron screw. Sorry, the beam was on one of the decks. Okay, the crew used the screw to fix the beam. God knows all things. He knew the Pilgrims would need that screw. So it was amazing that a pilgrim had packed this large iron screw to hold up the beam that was holding the deck up. You see? Look on the bottom, and you see the beams. Look, start at the bottom, the third tier, and those are beams. And if that cracked, then the deck above them would fall. Okay, we'll stop here for now. Unfortunately, I won't be able to do math right now because I have a special appointment, but tomorrow we will double up on the math assignment, which isn't that very long. Okay, have a nice day.